because time is short, we won't have any introductions. We'll just go straight in the order in which they appear on the program. And the first presentation is Human Interconnectedness, Andrew Linklater.
I want to thank Ken Ruiz first of all for the opportunity to take part in this tribute to Ken Waltz. I do so with very fond memories of 6 weeks spent at Berkeley in the mid-1980s when my wife and I enjoyed the enormous hospitality of Ken and Helen Waltz. And I do so with fond memories of a conversation in a lift when Ken explained to me that he was a happy realist and I was an unhappy. That may not be too far. That may not be wide of the mark to this day. Ken Booth said it was perfectly legitimate to pay tribute to Ken Waltz by using some themes in his writings to do almost anything within the bounds of reason. And hopefully within the bounds of reason, I take some of Ken Waltz's themes from theory of international politics and try to build around them some very preliminary observations about theorizing very long-term processes of change. I start with territory that's very familiar to everybody. Here, everybody is familiar with those famous formulations in the theory book. I have in mind the reference to the striking sameness of international politics across the millennia, the dismaying persistence of the same logics, the dominion of certain propelling principles which are embedded in the self-help system because of the compulsions of anarchy. And I begin also with a theme which is very familiar to you all, and that is with Ken's methodological strategy, which is to abstract the system of states from the wider totality of social and political relations, or as he puts it at one point, to consider international politics as a domain apart, quickly adding, there is an artifice in doing this, everything is in reality connected with everything else. I want to consider what might be called a parallel narrative to Ken's, one that is realist to a large degree, one that is also, I think, as Ken is, concerned with long-term processes of continuity and change. And that is the process sociological position taken by Norbert Elias. Elias, in various writings, says we live more or less as our ancestors did in the so-called period of barbarism. We continue to have struggles for power and security, elimination contests between survival units still dominate and may continue until such time as humanity is unified in the shape of a world state. What changes over time, says Elias, is the method of killing, the scale of killing, and perhaps in the West, as a consequence of the European civilizing process, the degrees of pleasure and joy taken in killing and in violence. But in a very important contrast with neorealism, Elias argues at one point, we must always ask what some abstracted domain has been abstracted from. And we must always ask, what might we discover about ourselves if we put the abstracted domain back into its setting, back into the wider totality of social and political life? And what if we ask, what are the connections between developments in the state system and developments affecting human society as a whole? And cutting a very long story short, Elias suggests that the wider totality is the growth of human interconnectedness from the beginning of time, indeed beginning with biological features of the human race that make something called human interconnectedness possible, and that have allowed our species, against the odds at various points, to dominate the planet, to exterminate large numbers of non-human species, and of course to transform all life on the planet. It's worth adding that the process sociological point of view is very much concerned with what Barry Buzan and Richard Little have called presentism. Elias referred with dismay to the retreat of sociologists into the present, into the sort of 10-year horizon, and the loss of the long-term perspective, the loss of discussion of longer-term patterns of change. And that is coupled with a theme which clearly owes a lot to 19th century thinkers, and perhaps even some 18th century thinkers too, that by understanding the long term we might have a better chance of controlling processes that have forced human beings together, often very much against their will, but forcing them to perhaps learn, no guarantees, but forcing them to try to learn perhaps how to live together without the levels of violent and non-violent harm that have accompanied their history thus far. Now, when looking at the revival, if I can put it this way, of grand narratives in process sociology, it is always made clear that there is a debt to the great meta-narratives of the 19th century, but at the same time there is a critique of those great meta-narratives for very familiar reasons, because of the commitment to teleology, because of the commitment to historical inevitability or irreversibility, and because of certain constructions of the past that just so happen to lead to flattering self-images in the West. European societies come at the end of history, for example. And process sociologists like Elias reject, of course, all that stuff, while quickly adding the baby was thrown out with the bathwater in many of the critiques of the great historical meta-narratives. Again, this is a reference to the lack of the long-term perspective. And the point is also made, and this was touched upon in the last session, that recreating grand narratives now is very difficult, not least because of skepticism that some meta-narrative lurks behind the scene, not least because, as Chris Brown pointed out earlier on, there may be immense dangers of straying rather far from reliable sources of evidence, and of course because some half-baked preconceived notion of the past may be slapped onto, used to interpret the past. And there's a sense in which those problems cannot be solved. The question is whether it's worth putting up with the problems for other benefits. Elias's position is quite clear. It's worth the suffering of going through this process of struggling to recreate the grand narrative in order to acquire approaches to the past which may at some point emulate the achievements of the natural sciences. And it's very interesting, I think, that Elias stresses the importance of those scholars of natural sciences who cut their way through the undergrowth to construct paths to studies of very long-term processes of change, in the case of geology, astronomy, physics, and so forth. So we are kind of being invited by the process sociologists to model our activity on certain conceptions of the natural scientific project. As for trying to recreate grand narratives in more detail, there are two or three themes that keep cropping up in process sociology. The first one, in fact, is probably best introduced by referring to a very famous and, I think, influential paper by Robert Carnero back in the late 1960s, where in a paper in Science, where he says there has been a long-term process of cultural development over the last 6,000 to 8,000 years, in which humans find themselves in ever larger concentrations of power, but also in ever fewer concentrations of power. The political units increase in size and decrease in number. Overall, there have been setbacks and reversal overall. And others have referred to the scaling up of social and political organization over the last 6 millennia. Elias, being quite close to realism in many ways, stressed the importance of the monopoly mechanism. Security dilemmas seem to force societies for largely defensive purposes, more often than not, to expand their territorial domain, and so on, and so on. And this may never end, the story goes. There's then a link made with the relationship between state formation and the growth of economic interdependence, and the narrative here tends to focus on the extent to which, first of all, internal pacification made it possible for commercial relations to extend, and also how what there may have been in the way of international pacification between stable monopolies of power enabled transnational commercial linkages to develop. The story can be made more complicated than that, as Mental Man points out in Volume 1 of Sources of Social Power. In the ancient Near East, there were times when economic and cultural integration ran ahead of political integration. Political integration came last, as it were, in a sequence of universalizing processes. Well, we can see that there's a story here about the relationship between the formation of territorial monopolies of power and the growth of ever more dense connections between human beings. There's a story about state formation being a tipping point in human development. I think we all know this, maybe take this for granted or forget to remind ourselves of how important this whole process of early state formation was. And given the fact we live in states and they've been around for a while and look set to continue, it's very easy for us, I guess, to think of this process of state formation, this monopoly mechanism, as something that was almost inevitable and perhaps even preordained. But there is no automatic causal link. This sounds like an assertion, it's actually a question. There is no automatic causal link, is there, between the self-help system, war and geopolitical rivalry, and the monopolization of political power. War makes the state makes war. Does war make the state? Has it always made states? There's more to do here. I think it was Owen Lattimore, someone will have to help me out here perhaps later. I think it was Owen Lattimore who said that the Great Wall had 2 purposes. One was to keep the supposed barbarians out, and the other was to keep the Chinese in. The point he's making is that warfare creates the conditions in which human beings are forced together. It also creates conditions in which there's a temptation to defect, to go over the wall, to go to the other side. And certainly many early states, according to some, most early states, collapsed under their own weight because of such centrifugal tendencies. There are those who suggest that we need at this point to augment the account of monopolization and human interconnectedness, economic interconnectedness, with an account of changes in emotional identification, a theme that Nick brought up in the last session. And certainly those that I've read, and I confess there aren't that many, but those that I've read who work on the archaeology of early states seem to agree that a concentration of power was not sufficient to reproduce bounded communities. It was essential to create wider frameworks of thought, more universalistic ideologies, religious pantheons, and so forth, that bound people together, or at least bound together the actually or potentially most powerful and disruptive social strands. And process sociology comes at this by borrowing a term, I think wisely, from music. We are looking at processes whereby humans become more attuned to each other, over extended social links. And these are being processes in complicated ways unfolding over many thousands of years. And I'll make a leap to Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant may have been amongst the first of moderns to give an account of the past that very much stresses the processes that I've been describing, and highlights what I call the ambiguities of rising levels of human interconnectedness. On the one hand, humans enjoy, says Kant, the enormous benefits of commercial exchange, intellectual exchange. On the other hand, he says, as non-Europeans are well aware, in China, in Africa, in Japan, these extensions of social relations have made it possible for some to cause what he calls evil in more distant places. And Kant can be read, at least in this way, as suggesting that what human beings have to do is kind of catch up ethically with the material connections that have bound them together. They have to find ways of being attuned in a cosmopolitan way as a consequence of being forced together by state formation, patterns of commercial exchange, and so forth. Kant also thought, and here there are parallels with Elias, and there are parallels with William McNeill and David Christian and other exponents of world or big history, that universal history can provide us with a high level of detachment from present circumstances, present problems, immediate crises that tend to lock us into nation-centric modes of thought. And certainly Kant is adamant that universal history can make us aware of these long-term developments in our capacity to cause violent and non-violent harm, but also be aware of what, in fact, we bequeath to future generations if we leave things untouched. There are responsibilities to the future, which become more clear to us if we reflect on the long journey to this point, and to the lag I've described between material processes of interconnectedness and modes of ethical life still very much centered around the sovereign or nation and state. And as I walk my way towards my conclusion, I would stress at this point that Kant may be at the beginning of a modern orientation to the past that stresses revolutions in the capacity to cause harm to each other and to the natural world, which stresses human ingenuity in inventing new forms of violent and non-violent harm, and in realizing the need for us now to reorganize modes of thought, to create wider frameworks of thought and action, because we are at another tipping point in the development of the human race. I'm referring to here, of course, ecological problems, and to a narrative that one can find in various influential popular histories, popular narratives that go back that look at many centuries. Jared Diamond, of course, being amongst them. Well, I hope I'm inside my allotted time. A couple of conclusions. One is that if one runs this parallel to Kant's narrative, a parallel which agrees with so much but makes a different methodological move near the start, one has an invitation to move to what Elias called a high level of synthesis, which combines the study of material, ideational, and indeed emotional transformations of social life over not just centuries but millennia. There's then, I guess, the question of whether this kind of analysis is any more optimistic or pessimistic, any happier or unhappier than realism or neorealism or its alternatives. And there isn't time to go into this, but I'll simply say that writers like Elias were good realists in making the point that the self-help system will continue to block the path to rapid transformations in the way we live together, in the way we are organized. The self-help system will continue to block the path to rapid change in learning how to live together amicably. However, the point is made, we remain at an early stage of human interconnectedness. We are still, Elias said in a memorable phrase, living in humanity's prehistory. And we may be at the beginning of a long collective learning process that will enable humans to reduce the ambiguities of human interconnectedness, assuming, he quickly pointed out, we do not destroy ourselves first. Thank you.
Next up in this theme, continuity and change, is Ian Clark, and the title of his presentation is Anarchy, Legitimacy, and Hegemony: How Hierarchical Can International Society Be? Ian, it's your turn.
Thank you. I don't know if there is a Visa prize for the largest number of random concepts you can squeeze into a paper title. If there is such a prize, I would like the department to nominate me for it. Ken Booth, when he first approached me on this, offered me 3 concepts to work with. I found that unduly constraining, and therefore decided to add an extra couple to the mix. My fellow members, inmates of this institution, will know only too well that a number of years ago I succumbed to the legitimacy virus. I'm afraid I have not been able to shake it off. The current prognosis is not good. It looks as if this could indeed be a terminal condition. I do appear to be stuck with it in perpetuity. The list of concepts in my paper, I hope, is not wholly random, even if it might appear to some of you at this stage to be so. The 2 central concepts that form the core of the larger project in which I am currently involved are the 2 concepts of legitimacy and hegemony. And let me pause there just for a second. There are 2 things I immediately want to stress about this term hegemony before we go any further. First of all, I see this as a direct continuation of what I've been doing up to this point about issues in international legitimacy. So it's not a change of direction, it's a continuation of it. And the way I see it in my own mind, possibly confused, but nonetheless it's the way I see it, is that for any kind of theory of legitimacy, hegemony is the ultimate hard case. And if I can nail down something that works in this area, then I will feel I've achieved something. In the last 2 days, a number of people have used the term hegemony in various questions and presentations. They have all used it in a sense that is quite at variance from the sense in which I mean it. It doesn't mean that their use of that term has been illegitimate in any sense. I don't own the term hegemony, but there is a fundamental distinction between the way I am using it and the way it has been used by others. And the second immediate point I want to make is my hegemony does not presently exist. And I think all of the references to hegemony made by others implied that it was a currently existing condition, and the US was the possessor of it. So let me emphasize these 2 points. My two core concepts are then bookended in the title by the notions of anarchy and hierarchy, and they're very self-consciously bookended in that way, in order to allow me in this paper to bump up against Ken Waltz's world. In other words, to place what I want to say about legitimacy and hegemony in the context of the two discrete organizing principles of anarchy and hierarchy. And as you'll see in a second, I'm basically asking the question, does the notion of hierarchy cause some kind of insurmountable problem for the notion of hegemony that I seek to develop? Now, in the paper, I think you can see that my notion of hegemony bumps up against Ken Waltz's world in two contexts or two senses, and if I can just quickly summarize what I think these are. First of all, there is a general sense in which I bump up against it. And let me now very quickly just make a number of assertions, some of which may seem relatively uncontentious, others of which will no doubt provoke degrees of outrage within the audience. Three things. States engage in practices of power, and the resultant distributions of that power are important. And that's me speaking. And I think at that point, even if the language might differ, I think there are probably few who share Ken Waltz's world or John Mearsheimer's world would particularly dissent from that. Remains to be seen. Secondly, states also engage in what I choose to call practices of legitimacy. And I think the divergence in the road begins to appear here. Again, as many other people have done, I looked through theory of international politics, the word legitimacy in the index. It's not there, doesn't mean it's not mentioned in the text, but again, I can't find it. Thirdly and critically, I want to argue that these practices of power and practices of legitimacy are not distinct activities. Practices of legitimacy come to some degree to be constitutive of the practices of power. And I suspect the divergence at that point is fairly sharp indeed. So that's the general context in which I bump up against Ken Waltz's world. The second, more specific, is at face value a point of immediate convergence. Let me quote just a brief half sentence from Theory of International Politics. The lengthier quote is set out in the paper. Waltz wrote, "In any realm populated by units that are functionally similar but of different capability, those of greatest capability take on special responsibilities." And the English school collectively would of course say amen to that. With a significant proviso, the great powers, those that enjoy the greater capability, don't just take on a special responsibility. It is in some sense, however loosely conceptualized, recognized and conferred. The question that I want to put on the back of that Waltzian statement is, can that apply if there is the single great power only? Can it be made to apply to that? The notion of hegemony, to begin to edge my way into it, has, in international relations literature, raised a substantial number of objections. Generally speaking, hegemony has had a very bad press in international relations. Most see it as something that has to be averted. In fact, in some fundamental sense, the whole point of international relations is to try and avert the emergence of such a thing. So the standard objections that I want to try and engage with then are the ideas that hegemony is, in some basic sense, incompatible with the notion of international society. The argument that hegemony is incompatible with international society because it forms some kind of hierarchy, and I'll come back to that point just shortly. And I very much want to argue against what is a fairly standard usage of hegemony in the literature, which is that it is simply a synonym for some kind of dominance or primacy enjoyed by the most powerful state. So people who quite reasonably use hegemony to mean that are talking about hegemony in a quite fundamentally different sense from the sense that I'm attempting to develop here. In the work that I've done to date, this project has been running for about a year now, and I've attempted a number of papers on this. And I've been tending to go directly from literature on legitimacy then straight into literature on hegemony. And someone pointed out a couple of months ago that the one thing that I wasn't addressing at all in any of these papers, was the notion of hierarchy. And this was something that had been in my mind a few years ago when I wrote the first book in the subject. I quoted Tim Dunn's 2003 paper. Tim, unfortunately, is no longer with us this afternoon. In a paper, he asked the question, I quote, "How far is an international society composed of a plurality of sovereign states compatible with hierarchy?" And that is, in a sense, reformulating the Waltzian distinction that is so deeply embedded in much of the IR literature. And so, when I was invited by Ken to present at this conference, this seemed the obvious occasion for me to try and grapple with that question. So my question in turn then becomes something like, is the kind of hegemony that I have in mind compatible with anarchy as a traditional feature of international society? Now, the kind of reasoning that would lead to the answer no seems to me to basically take the following form. And if I can sum it up in a kind of syllogism, if you like, the reasoning that you find in a lot of the literature is that hierarchies, by definition, are not anarchies. They have discrete principles. Hegemony is a form of hierarchy, therefore hegemony is not an anarchy. I'm kind of quickly and nervously looking to Hidemi. Is that a syllogism? Is that pass the test? Close enough for Socrates, okay. That seems to be the general reasoning that has led a number of commentators to reach the conclusion that hegemony in a sense goes beyond the pale of what is acceptable within an international society whose governing principle is predominantly one of anarchy. Now, in reality, in practice, Ken Waltz had, of course, pointed out in a number of places in the work, that real-life political systems don't adhere rigidly simply to the one organizing principle or the other. They tend, on the whole, to be mixed. And mixed political systems are part of the historical record. And for a chunk of the full paper, what I've done is to review some of that literature. Some of it goes back to a very significant early paper that Nick Onuf co-authored, I think about 25 years ago, so thanks belatedly for that, Nick. And that literature broadly comes to, for our purposes, a consensual position that we can think in terms of hierarchy in anarchy or hierarchy under anarchy, and the two are to that degree not mutually contradictory. Now, having established that to my satisfaction, I then take it gives me license to make the move that is the fundamental move in my whole project. And that's the, if you like, the basically English school move that is central to what I'm trying to do. If an anarchical society is compatible with degrees of hierarchy, and if, as all the major English school theorists have told us in the past, that the principal characteristic of international society historically is the development of its distinctive institutions, and we all know the standard lists from Hedley Bull of the slightly longer list that Barry has developed for us, but including critically, for my purposes, the institutions of the role of the great powers and the balance of power, which seem to me are the two that I'm most directly interested in. That then gives me an opening that was not taken by the principal exponents of the English school, for whom I think, to a man as they were, international society in Adam Watson's terms was anti-hegemonial. But of course, anti-hegemonial in the sense of hegemony that I myself am not using. My question, what if you are faced with a distribution of power in which there is a concentration in one unit that enjoys a capability far in surpass of all of the rest? What then has international relations theory in general, and more specifically the English school, to say about that situation, which, as it happens, is the situation that we have been facing for at least the last 10 or 15 years? And we can have a discussion about how long that might continue to be the case in the future. And so my argument is, and I'm not going to develop the full logic of it here, it's in another paper I've written that will come out in a few months. But basically my suggestion is that we think about hegemony as a potential, not an existing, a potential institution of international society, given that we do happen to be facing a world in which there is a concentration of capability. That's the world we face. It's the world we live in. And as IR scholars, I think we need to try and say something more about that than we have been able to this point to do. English school theorists regarded international society as anti-hegemonial, and of course the principal writings took place in the Cold War period for Bull and others. The notion of a world dominated by the United States was not something that was a reality, that in engaged in intellectual tension, but it is what we have now. I think those that write about US primacy and whether it will endure or not, the subtext of much of that debate, in a way similar to the English school, is a concentration of power of that kind for international relations is an unnatural condition, and we just want to wish it away. We stop the clock. International politics stops now. It will resume at some point in the future when we have a balance of power that again works. Well, I'm sorry, we cannot stop the clock for the next 20 years. For reasons that are part of the subtext of Andrew's paper, we do not have these 20 years to waste. So we need to theorize about what we can do in that period. Thank you.
Right. Right, the final paper is by Barry Buzan and Richard Little. The title is Waltz and World History, The Paradox of Parsimony. And this will be a living case study in the possibility of trust, because Richard Little will be giving the paper, Barry Buzan will be answering the question.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, for better or worse, I'm presenting, and Barry's going to sit like Buddha, oozing intelligence. So if you think I'm talking garbage, you just tune out and just contemplate on that. Okay. Well, perhaps I'd like to start also by paying tribute to Ken Booth for organising this fantastic occasion. It really has been a very memorable set of sessions, which I certainly remember for a long time. Also, by way of introduction, in many of the papers, I realized when I came to read through them, at some point during the course of the paper, while often making quite deep-seated criticisms of Professor Waltz, also make very warm tributes. And I realized that actually our paper doesn't do that at any point formally. And I would, of course, hope it goes without saying that Barry and I obviously have huge respect for Waltz's work. But since we haven't done that, I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to pay a personal tribute, and for obvious reasons it's not going to be appearing in the paper, but it takes me back well over 20 years. It's frightening to think about how long ago it is, but we used to have a BISA working group called Theories of International Politics, which, or something along those lines, which was funded by what was then the SSRC. And at the end of one of the sessions, that's when I had Barry and Steve Smith, a whole host of other luminaries in the field, Barry came up to me and said, what did I think of theory of international politics? And well, at this point I ought to be able to tell you the answer. I truthfully can't remember the answer, but the answer that I should have given was that it was a book that I had read with interest and realized at the time that it would kind of have a permanent influence on my work ever after. But whatever answer I gave, Barry said, well, I'm thinking of doing a book which is going to use theory of international politics as a springboard, and would you like to contribute? And I said, yes. And that was the origins of what became Logic and Anarchy, and the start of what, certainly from my perspective, has been a very fruitful and rewarding collaboration with Barry. And so I'm very grateful to Ken Waltz for having kind of provided that impetus that moved Barry and I to work together. So many thanks, Ken, for that. Now, as it happens, Ken Booth, who it sounds as if he's given the titles for everybody, I think it's a bigger orchestrating impact than I realized, didn't ask us to kind of reflect on logic of anarchy, but to actually bring Waltz into conjunction with world history. And so Barry and I have batted ideas back and forth for a while, and Barry came up at one point with the title The Perils of Parsimony. And I think if we'd gone down that route, the logic would have been that theory of international politics provides a framework that's simply too parsimonious to provide a framework if you want to think about world history. So, whereas Waltz sees himself as sees parsimony as a virtue, I suppose we'd be seeing parsimony as something potentially, not as a vice obviously, but as something with a considerable downside. Now there's obvious merit to that suggestion, because it's very striking that when you go to the world history literature, there is simply no reference to Waltz. Anyway, I've never seen, certainly when we did the book on world history and the international system, I couldn't find any reference to Waltz at all. By contrast, Wallerstein gets picked up very substantially by, very substantially exaggerated, certainly gets quite a number of references by ancient historians, by archaeologists, but Waltz doesn't. On the other hand, it's worth saying neither does any other IR theorist. So I mean, the IR theory simply gets ignored by the world history historians. MacNeil in the 1990s, by contrast, saw Wallerstein as providing the leading candidate for a framework for world history. But he also added that it was still fumbling around for finding an adequate framework. But actually, Wallerstein has faded in world history literature. I had to do a big survey of world history literature over the summer, and it's very clear that Wallerstein is now seen as overly Eurocentric. So this, I suppose, raises the question of, well, maybe Waltz hasn't been picked up because he's also too Eurocentric. I think you could certainly make that argument. But nevertheless, I would also want to make the argument, I think that theory of international politics gets at the essence of what most of us see international relations as being about, and I suspect that that's part of the reason why international relations as a discipline whole has been seen as overly Eurocentric. So you could say that the problem with theory of international politics from the standpoint of world historians is not that it's too parsimonious, but that it's too Eurocentric. Well, for reasons that I'll come to at the end, as it happens, I think this argument doesn't work for theory of international politics. And we eventually, Barry and I, agreed on the title of the paradox of parsimony. So what is this Waltzian or world history paradox? Well, I think that Waltz unequivocally works on the assumption that he should have a kind of world historical perspective. He argues, again, lots of famous quotes have come over the last 2 days, but this is a very memorable one, that the texture of international politics remains highly constant. Patterns recur and events repeat themselves endlessly. So Waltz is setting himself the task of accounting for what he sees as the unchanging texture of international politics. And for reasons that this is kind of contentious in terms of some of the discussions we've had over the last 2 days, it's very clear it can't be because of human nature. He also argues it can't be because of the nature of the states, because they've changed across time. And he argues, of course, that the constant, unchanging texture relates through to the structure of the system. It's anarchy that provides us with the answer. It's a very brilliant move, it seems. It's simple, it's elegant, but it has very profound implications. And then the question is, well, so why is it not being picked up by world historians? And of course, the answer is very straightforward. Despite its parsimony, and I don't think anybody would argue that the theory is expressed in extraordinarily spare and parsimonious terms, it also establishes a set of conditions. And the argument that we're making in this paper is that from the standpoint of most world historians, the conditions that Waltz lays down only has very limited applicability across the time-space canvas. In other words, it simply doesn't apply across the bulk of world history. So the paradox is, though it's been designed to be universal, it actually has rather limited application. And this doesn't diminish one iota the power or the strength of the theory, but it does then suggest that it's going to be more limited in terms of its applicability. Well, of course, I would also, of course, want to say, although Barry and I tried to provide a framework for looking at world history, I would just see it as a framework. I was interested in Weber's argument that frameworks actually in European terms are theory. I have to say I don't think we came up with anything close to a theory in the book that we wrote. And also I would want to say that the very idea of a theory of world history is simply a chimera. So it's a nonsense, really. So this paper isn't designed to critique in any way Waltz's theory, but to argue that it's more limited in scope than it's often presented as. And that what world history suggests is that actually there isn't a constant texture to international politics, that there aren't unchanging patterns, and that patterns don't repeat themselves endlessly. And what we do is to simply kind of use a Waltzian framework. We have a section on units, a section on systems, a section on structure, a section on process, and a section on functional differentiation, and also at the end a section on historical periodization. In a sense, drawing in a fairly casual manner on world historical literature, to having first of all tried to explicate what Waltz's position, show why world historians would suggest that these sorts of processes and structures, etc., are rather limited from a world history perspective. I'm also using world history in rather loose terms. It's bringing in an awful lot of the historical, sociological literature as well. And basically, that's the nub of the paper. And I haven't really got time to go through all the sections. So what I'll do is I'll focus in a little detail on the units, the first section. So I'll give you the flavor of what we're doing. If you find it interesting, then you can read the whole paper. And then I'll jump on to the end. So if we take units, what we all know, of course, is that Waltz's theory identifies like units. And I suppose the first question is, why does he use the term units? Well, he uses the term units because from Waltz's perspective, the kind of units that can operate within an anarchy can take radically different forms. And so sometimes you'll make reference to city-states, sometimes to empires, sometimes to nations, but admittedly outside of theory of international politics, he also makes references to tribes and firms and street gangs. So there are any unit, almost any kind of unit, can potentially operate in an anarchy. And that's why I think he makes reference to units rather than states. In other words, this is a theory that extends potentially beyond what we would conventionally refer to as international politics. And of course, as I indicated before, because these units take such a hugely different form across history, so I mean, Waltz is very happy to accept that there hasn't been some kind of constant notion of state even, we can easily accommodate the idea that the nature of the state has changed very dramatically across world history. From his perspective, it simply doesn't matter, because his definition of a unit is so spare. Now, Waltz, of course, then takes an additional step beyond saying that we're just talking about units, to say, if there's an internal development within a unit that gives it a power advantage, there will be a tendency for this development to be emulated by other units, which is then moving us towards the idea of like units. However, he instantly qualifies the kind of broader implications of that. He said that the theory does not lead to the conclusion that emulation proceeds to the point where competitors become identical. Well, having had that qualification, then the question becomes, well, so in what sense are they like units? And of course, as always with Waltz, there is a very clear answer to the question. They're like units because they're functionally undifferentiated. Again, there's a qualification. They're alike in the tasks that they face, but not in their ability to perform. So this is his parsimonious definition of a unit. Now, the critiques that have been almost instantly, and kind of been, this is a common recurring theme in critiques of Waltz, relate through to this idea of units. I mean, as it happens explicitly, he says a little bit more about the internal composition. So there is a presumption that these units are hierarchically organized within, raises the problem that perhaps Ian's paper raises, and that there is also functional differentiation. This is very familiar. So these are explicit assumptions about the state, but they're the only assumptions that he makes about these units. And so one of the criticisms would be, not a criticism in this case of this book, but a kind of refinement. Daniel Nexon, in I think a brilliant book which is coming out next year called Religious Conflict and Struggle for Power in Early Modern Europe, argues that actually there are 4 implicit assumptions about the units that are not specified. So I'll just give you these quickly. One is that the ties between units are relatively sparse. The second is that collective identification between units is weak, that the ties within states are dense, and finally that collective identification within units is strong. In other words, we're talking about a billiard ball model. This is very famous metaphor that Wolfers came up in this, I think rightly celebrated in the first night, discord and collaboration. Also kind of reminded me a bit of Karl Deutsch. I was interested in Netanyahu's reference to Karl Deutsch. I had to read Deutsch in my first year at university. Secondly, a second kind of criticism. So the point here is that Nexon makes is, actually, if you look at states, these 4 kind of implicit conditions simply don't apply during the religious wars, and the state then just doesn't look like a billiard ball, doesn't look anything like a billiard ball. Okay, the second criticism has come from Osiander in his, I have to confess I haven't read the whole book, but it's a very impressive book called Before the State. I mean, basically the argument there is this whole idea of talking about states, I mean, ancient states, and just nonsense as far as Osiander is concerned. You can't talk about the state before the start of the 19th century. Osiander argues that Waltz presupposes homogeneous units. And I think he rather, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think, says, Waltz talks about street gangs and firms and tribes, but he's never suggesting that the system consists of relations between street gangs, firms, and tribes. there is a presumption that the units that we're looking at are like units. So there are very strict limits to how different the units can actually be. But Osiander's argument is that actually if we look at world history, what we find is not homogeneous systems of like units, but heterogeneous systems. Heterogeneous, not homogeneous systems, have in fact been the norm in Western civilization, he argued. So that's the second line of criticism. And a third line of criticism from Ferguson and Mansbach is that the historical record reveals that the norm is actually, again, not this kind of billiard ball model, but layered and overlapping politics. That's the historical norm. Well, we know already what Waltz's response will be to this. It's the response that he made to John Ruggie, when Ruggie indicated that he couldn't really denote any change between the medieval period and the modern period in European history. Ken Waltz's argument is actually, that's because from my perspective there wasn't. I think my model will apply just as well to the feudal period as to the modern period. And of course it's at that point that large numbers of historians just throw up their hands and say, well, but this is just too parsimonious. It's kind of getting too far away from the conditions which you've laid down in the first place. And I think that I would agree with that. I mean, I think that a better response would have been, yes, okay, we can't apply that. I'm not suggesting we can apply it to every single circumstance. The conditions have to apply. But I suspect that that Ken Waltz would probably want to stick with that position. Now, I've almost run out of time, so I'm going to slip over without just over the section on systems, section on structure, section on process, and a section on periodization. Let me just come on to the end. I suggested at the beginning that in a sense the world historians have completely ignored international relations generally, but certainly Waltz's work in particular. This, I think now, I need to backtrack a little. There have been two, I think, very formidable books published in the last 2 years by Art Eckstein, who is a classical historian, reads Greek, and he knows his sources exceptionally well. One called Mediterranean Anarchy, Interstate War, and the Rise of Rome, came out in 2006, and then one came out earlier this year. Rome enters the Greek East from anarchy to hierarchy in Hellenistic Mediterranean. Both have opening chapters which review the realist literature, basically the neo-realist literature. And Art Eckstein's argument is that this literature provides a very rich source of explanation for trying to understand the rise of Rome. And that classical historians have looked far too closely at unit-level explanations at the expense of systemic explanations. They have not understood that you could treat the Mediterranean as an anarchy. And he argues that you get a very much more nuanced and interesting explanation for the rise of Rome if you use this literature. Now, I'm slightly cheating here, because although he makes lots of references to Ken Waltz, at the end of the day, he actually prefers offensive realism over However, I'm sure, as my final word, John Mearsheimer, a generous man, would accept that he is in fact, of course, standing not only alongside the king of thought, but standing on the shoulders of a giant. Thank you very much.